and welcome to the first of two videos that'll serve as quick introductions to Inkscape for folks here at Pinecrest who want to be able to use some of the vector-based tools in the iLabs like the Cricut machines and the laser cutters. So here's what we'll be doing in these two videos. This first one, we're just going to talk a little bit about what Inkscape is and when we should use it and how it's different from other graphic software. And we're not going to really go through installation because it's a little different whether you have a Mac or a PC. But there is a link on the page that you found this video link that goes to installation instructions. And the good folks at IT can always help with that as well. And then we're going to go into Inkscape and learn some of the basic tools and ask you to take a few moments to play around with those and figure out how Inkscape basically works. So let's start with what it is and when we should use it. Inkscape is a type of graphic software known as vector graphics. It's different from the graphic software that you're probably familiar with for when you're just taking regular pictures, because when you use a digital camera, whether it's on your phone or something higher end than that, pictures are taken using pixels. Basically, the way the graphics are represented on the screen is by making lots and lots of little squares, and those squares are called pixels, and each square has its own position and its own color, and by putting all of those together you get a pretty realistic looking image. This is called raster graphics, and while there are ways to add raster graphics into especially the laser cutter engraver, most of what we're going to do in these videos have to do with another kind of graphics called vector graphics. So let's go into Inkscape and see what the difference is there. There we go. So here's an Inkscape page. And here's the difference. If I make a square or some other shape in Inkscape, that square is actually not really represented in the computer as just a bunch of little squares put together. It's actually represented by points defining corners and edges and curves, and then lines connecting those points. In fact, let's show you how that works if I zoom in a little bit here on this nice little square that I just made. This square is made by 4 individual points. Each point is then connected by a line. And I can actually grab those points and move them and change the shape, which is cool and everything. But the really important thing to kind of think about when you're dealing with vector graphics instead of raster graphics is that the computer kind of draws these images by just connecting the lines between these points. And the points are just points on an XY plane, kind of like you learned about way back in math class. And why this is important is the tools that we want to send these files to, like the Cricut machine or the laser cutter, they don't really know what to do most of the time with raster graphics, with all the little squares and the different colors. But they can take their cutting blade or their laser and go to one point and then draw a line to the next point, and the next point, and the next point, and the next point. And so in the case of the laser cutter or in the Cricut, the result would be that it's tracing out and actually cutting through the material by following those points. So in order to create graphics for these machines, we need to use a vector graphic program like Inkscape. And we're using Inkscape for this because it's free, you can download it, you can install it on any computer, and there are other vector graphic programs that can be used. The most common ones are Adobe Illustrator and CorelDRAW, but they're much more expensive and kind of harder to get to. So we're going to use Inkscape for this class, and that's what most of the students, many of the students will be using in the iLabs. So what we'd like for you to do now is familiarize yourself with some of the tools that are here in the toolbar, and use them to just start making things. And you can kind of make anything you want to. I'm going to go through and demonstrate the tools and then afterwards ask you just to play for a while. In the second video, we're going to walk you through something a little bit more structured that you'll actually bring to one of the iLabs and cut out on the machines. But for now, let's just play a little bit. So you saw the tool here that makes rectangles and squares. Pretty easy to use if you've used any other drawing program. You can just go ahead and trace it out. Now you'll notice that it ended up with a black line and a yellow fill. And you'll find up here on the screen that it's showing me that, the fill and stroke. One toolbar or one window that you're always going to want to have up when you're working with this is the fill and stroke window. So I'm going to go to Object, Fill and Stroke here, and it's going to open up these settings. And so if you want to change the fill on the inside, you can go to the Fill tab and you can turn it off, or you can turn it back on again and change its color using these color changing tools. Same for the stroke. The color of the stroke is determined here. You can turn the stroke, the outside line, off, or you can change its color pretty easily. We're going to talk more about this in the next video because the settings on these are very important in your final graphics so that you can send these images properly to the machines. But for now, play around with the colors and figure it out. There's a circle tool. Same idea. And then there's a polygon star tool that can be really fun to work with and helpful for depending on what you're making. And when you choose it, you can choose between making regular polygons or stars, and you can choose the number of corners it's going to have. So I've got it set for regular polygon and 5 corners, so I should be able to make a pentagon there. Or if I switch to star mode, make a star. The next tool that I think you're going to find really helpful for making odd-shaped things and more interesting things, and that your students will probably use a lot when they're using these machines, is this tool right here, the Bezier Curve tool. And the way it works, and I'm going to just change my line color here a little bit so that you can see what I'm doing. The way this works when you select on it is you go ahead and you can click in a point, and it will create your shape. And so you can make something more complicated and interesting than just a square or a polygon, or a regular polygon. So what if you want to draw shapes that have curves in them? So what you do differently is when you click, you hold the mouse button down and you pull, and you get these 2 little dots called handles, and you can see that as you move them closer and further, and as you spin them around, you can change the curve. So now you can make some of the more interesting, complicated shapes. And you can go back to straight lines and corners as well. So there are some other tools that look similar to this. There's a freehand line tool. Which I always have a hard time with the mouse, but maybe you have a drawing tablet. And there's a calligraphy tool that kind of works the same way, that lets you make shapes and lines and curves and corners the same way as the Bezier. But it doesn't really lend itself to the machines we're going to be using, so I'm going to skip over that. Finally, though, I want to talk about the text tool. And by just clicking on it and drawing yourself a box the size that you'd like your text to end up, you can make yourself a little text box. And when you do, you'll notice that you can highlight text, and there are some basic text controls up here, very similar to what you might see in something like Microsoft Word, that lets you change the fonts or change the sizes or some other options. So with just this really basic overview, please go ahead and start up a document and start playing with those tools and see what you can make for yourself. And when you've given yourself a chance to play around a little bit, head on over to the next video and I'll lead you through making something.